Thank you for joining us for the program COVID-19, Our Data Security and Privacy at Risk. Our first speaker is Mary Hildebrand, a partner at Lowenstein Sandler in New Jersey. For more than 30 years, Mary has drawn on her deep experience in privacy and data security, tech, and intellectual property to handle sophisticated technology deals from concept to conclusion. Mary regularly serves as lead counsel to both public and private companies in complex commercial matters involving digital and social media, software, clean tech, renewable energy, public utilities, financial services, medical devices, entertainment, e-commerce, transportation, universities, and not-for-profit organizations. Additionally, she counsels startups on the transactions and foundational legal structures needed to launch their businesses. Our next speaker is Benjamin Jacob, a partner at PDGB in Paris. Passionate about technology, Benjamin assists a variety of clientele, including specialized SMEs such as large French and international groups, for all their needs relating to IT and telecommunications law. His main areas of intervention are IT contracts, software, databases, online games, electronic commerce, and telecommunications law. Benjamin also has special competence in matters of copyright, neighboring rights, and audiovisual law. He is also involved in industrial property law, both in advice and in litigation. Our next speaker is Michael Liu, a partner at Hylands law firm in Beijing. He serves as the chair of the legal committee of AmCham China. He is a representative of TerraLex, a member of INTA, a committee member of the International Business Committee of Chaoyang Lawyer Association, and the director of Siemens Chamber. He is also a lecturer of the Hochschule Darmstadt University of Applied Sciences, the Beijing Chemistry University, the Peking University, and he is an expert of the Belt and Road Commercial Dispute Mediation Group of the Beijing Bar Association in 2017. Our final speaker is Markus von Fuchs, a partner at SKW Schwarz in Berlin. Markus advises in intellectual property law, in particular in competition, patent, and trademark law, as well as on the protection of know-how. He advises companies on protecting and commercially exploiting intellectual property, for example, through licensing, sales, R&D, and cooperation agreements. He also focuses on the judicial and extrajudicial defense of intellectual property rights in interim injunction and principal proceedings. He also advises many companies on developing and introducing new technologies and business models. He has particular expertise in the optical and medical technology sectors.
So, hi everybody. These are not normal times. Usually I would say hello to everybody and great that you made it here and you made the long trip and traveled so far to participate in our panel discussion. And wow, so many good-looking people in the audience, fantastic. Today it's completely different, and I think this is it proves that something has changed in the last months. And we are talking about tech things where we usually would meet somewhere in the world. So it works, and somehow it changed our behavior and our way of doing business. And in my opinion, I guess it is not only caused by COVID-19, it's also something which we discussed before Corona or COVID-19, remote working, home office, flexible working hours, less traveling for environmental reasons. So all these discussions we already had before, but as always, a crisis like that is extremely speeding up or accelerating development, an already existing development. And the thing is that if a development is accelerated like that, very often the legal framework is not following in the same speed. And that's exactly what we want to talk today about. And well, the first round of questions for the panelists would be, and we are very, very privileged to have here panelists, fantastic panelists from 3 continents with completely, from time to time, also different views on legal solutions for problems. And I think this is extremely interesting today. So the first question would be, if you are considering the events of the recent months caused by COVID-19, do you see any impact in legal regulations or political discussions about modifications of legislation caused by this new reality we are living all in? Mary?
Thank you, Markus. As you were repeating the question, I was wondering how we could spend an hour discussing that alone, I think. The legal and political responses to COVID, they're closely linked, but sadly, they're not always aligned. The cross currents in response make this very, very difficult, I think, for everyone. The sheer amount of personal data available as people moved their personal and professional lives completely online. And on the other side, you have a sharp rise in cybersecurity incidents. So those are two trends happening at exactly the same time, and responses vary. And as you observed earlier, Markus, the legal response is, as always, lagging. Another cross current is, and this has very significant political overtones, at least here in the US. We have a significant tension between those advocating for continued lockdowns for reasons of public health, and then on the converse, opening the economy. Globally, of course, that's country by country, but here in the US with our federalist system, that is literally state by state. So that generates a lot of, and of course, that's a continuum, right? So it's not like everyone has to be, continued lockdowns no matter what and open the economy freely. We have everything in between. And one of the consequences of that here in the US is that, and to top it all off, we have no national comprehensive data protection law. So we don't have a common framework to look to. And one of the consequences is that our regulators, the ones that do enforce the privacy laws that we have responded inconsistently. Two quick examples before you move on. HIPAA, which, as you likely know, is our, or may know, I shouldn't assume, is our federal law passed to protect the privacy and security of medical information. And that's been in effect for a couple of decades. And surprisingly, even before the national emergency was declared, the federal agency responsible for enforcing HIPAA, Health and Human Services, actually relaxed enforcement and penalties. They waived them during COVID for the reason that they wanted community-based testing sites to function. They wanted disclosures about medical conditions made freely to first responders and medical personnel. And most significantly, I think the greatest impact has been to allow free use of telehealth services, which to this point had been primarily used in very rural areas, and it wasn't a first choice. I think that may be a permanent change, but time will tell. So we are buffeted here by a lot of different cross currents, I would say, a number of them.
Thank you, Mary. Great. Michael, China seemed to be extremely well prepared for a crisis like that, and I guess it was not the first one you had. So what are your views on this?
You are absolutely right. China has gone through SARS, which is a really terrible thing, and it hit China very badly. So people on the ground really know what it means. And when Corona-19 came, a lot of Chinese have been, I would not say fully prepared. I don't think we are prepared, in terms of the daily life, in terms of mentally and physically and everything. But because what we have gone through before, then when the government's saying, let's not go out and people will stay inside the house. And that actually, I think, was the key, especially for the very first 3 weeks, to not stop the virus, but kind of get as many people as possible under control so that the virus will be under control. So I think that's what we've been doing. In order to answer your questions, that what we have seen is kind of interesting for the last, what, that will be today is June, so that will be last 5 months, 4 or 5 months for what we have gone through. We have two very interesting. On the left-hand side, we have all of these cell phone apps that have been used, that people have to volunteer all of the information, where you've been traveling. Now, this is not to be very general, like the city or province. No. You have to be very, very specific, which exactly location, which exactly room where you are, which exactly the hotel, the room number, the flight number, the train, everything. You have to volunteer that, and you can now lie. And you, not only that, you have to provide all of that, you have to provide a lot of personal data, that your cell phone number, your ID number, your name, almost everything that you would consider as privacy information about one citizen or one individual. Now, the other hand is that from the legislation standpoint, it has been very interesting because we have cybersecurity law, we have Chinese criminal law, we have all of that, but all of them been very general and or even keep silent on the so-called personal information until just these months. Well, actually last month, we start having this new law come out. It's China very first PRC civil code, and this civil code I will talk about later. Make very specific definition about personal data, personal information, and everything. And that's what we have seen. It's kind of interesting in China.
Sounds really interesting. And as you said before, we are coming to that later on. Benjamin, you are sitting on 2 chairs today. You are, of course, the representative of France, but you're also representative of Europe, which is very, very difficult. As Europe is a very heterogenic organization, and well, we are discussing many things way too long, and we always find completely different solutions, which makes it quite difficult to see us as a common market, or as a common, not a country, but a very strong organization, not even a federal organization, something like that. So it is very, very difficult for Europeans to act somehow coordinated. And who else could explain us a bit more about that than the French? So Benjamin.
Thank you, Markus. I guess that a German guy will do it as good as I could. Well, as a matter of fact, my feeling is that somehow this pandemic showed, well, the drawbacks of Europe. One specific point that well, struck me is that we couldn't find a unified way of dealing with this matter at the very beginning, nor at what I'd like to see as the very end. Including with what we'll discuss later on, certainly what we call the tracing apps. From the French perspective, my feeling is that somehow we were not prepared at all. Clearly, we were not prepared. Rather technically, medically, legally, on any ground, we were not prepared. And that we had to rush on every aspect. Rush on legal regulation in order to find solution on the short term. Rush from companies what are going to organize themselves to continue working. Rush from the governments in order to try and find masks and everything that's necessary to deal with this pandemic. And rushing is not a good thing, of course. Because we lack some perspective, we lack the preparation, and we lack the vision. So, for instance, when it comes to companies in France, from one day to the other, we discovered that we were about to be locked down 2 days after the announcement. So that's a real tricky situation to handle. And what happened basically is that every companies said to the employees, okay, you can stay at home, use your own IT hardware and software to do your work, use Zoom to make meetings, and we'll see how it works. But I'm not sure of the number of legal in-house who took the time to read the Zoom terms and conditions, for instance. I won't even say the word negotiate the language of the terms and conditions, of course, but just reading them, understand what the service is, what are its flows, are there any kind of risk of breach of data, and so on and so on. This is what any of my clients would usually do before implementing any IT solution within the company. But here, nobody did that. We just used the solution we may found on the internet, and well, we'll see later on what's happened. So basically, we started with a situation which, from my perspective, could very well end up into some kind of a security crisis, because, well, we know that I talk about Zoom, but I have nothing against them. But we know that there were some breaches in the software, some holes that could be used in the code. Hopefully they corrected it, but for sure there will be other subjects like this. On the other side, we see those companies telling their employees to use their own computers, phones, software, and so on to work without any kind of legal consideration. While before COVID, of course, at least in France, we always advise our clients to take IT policy in the company that bind the employees, so that we can make sure that they use the right systems, that they take the necessary steps to protect the system and so on. Nothing like that was done here. Well, there is some kind of risk from my perspective in this regard. Also, I'm sure you all saw that, but since we were locked down, we use more and more internet solutions, internet services, whereas for work, but also for leisure, which means that we developed, we increased tremendously the data volume of use by the households, but also anyone who works. So this means that there is a huge increase in the data flow, at least in France, but I guess it's the same everywhere in the world. For the record, the Disney service that is supposed to compete with Netflix was supposed to launch at the very beginning of April in France, and the government asked Disney to postpone the launch because they were afraid that this will just break the internet, as we usually say. So there is a real increase in the data volumes, and this also means that, of course, there is a real increase in the use of personal data in this context. In a situation where we do not necessarily take more steps to protect this data, and the best example for that is that the way that the French government tries to fight the epidemic, notably with this application which is called Stop COVID, which is somehow similar to the Chinese one, but it's also different. But we will say a bit more about this later. But it shows that we are really in a rush, and rush is not a good thing.
Okay, thank you. So, as we mentioned before, I guess it's exactly the time where we have to think about data privacy, and even that was before the discussion, but it accelerated. It is more important than before because of our change in behavior, of course. And so data privacy is one of the biggest issues we have nowadays, I guess. And with panelists from China, the US, and Europe, we have also three very different views or standpoints on data privacy, which makes it quite interesting now. Somehow to probably discuss about what strengths and weaknesses probably the different concepts of data privacies are showing in times like that. So are we, and our concept of data privacy in Europe, are really prepared for probably the needs we are meeting at the moment? Or is it as good as it is, as we say, well, data privacy is very important, health is also very important, but should we give up all our privacy in order to do everything for health? It is probably not only a legal discussion, it's also a philosophic discussion or sociologic discussion. So what about France? Are you, or has France been prepared for something like that, or are already any modifications based on the experiences of the last months with COVID and the needs to be expected in France? So are you probably changing the concept of data privacy in France or not?
It might be evolving a little bit. As I said before, we were not prepared for the situation. But when it comes to data protection, as any European country, we have some kind of very good preparation with the GDPR, which kind of educated people on the risks when processing data, personal data, people, but also companies, also governments, and so on. So technically, we were not prepared, but still, we in Europe, as you know, Markus, have a very good knowledge of what data protection is, because, well, we have this regulation existing, and we had another one before that. So people are very sensitive about this subject. And actually, the discussion about data protection versus health is actually raging in France. I mean, this is something that is discussed every day on the news. Why? Because actually, as you may have heard, the government had the idea at the very beginning of the pandemic to develop an application for phones in order to track or trace people who might be sick, so that they could warn the other people that were in contact with this first one, so that they may be at risk. So this is actually very surprising. While we were not prepared, in something like 2 or 3 months, we were apparently ready to have this new application, which is technically speaking very complex. Well, in 2 or 3 months, the application is ready. Usually it takes much more time to develop such an application. So I said, it seems fast, because, well, actually, the application was supposed to be released today. And I checked just like 10 minutes ago, and it's still not released. And I wouldn't be surprised that they did not release it, because the French governments were in a situation very difficult to work with. As you may know, there is 2 approaches on this kind of apps. Of course, you have to install the app on the phones, and then you have to gather data. The thing is that, do you want the data to be processed on the phone itself, or the data to be processed on a centralized server? And this is the whole debate we had here. Should France use a centralized server? Are they willing to do, for different reasons? We might discuss after that. Or should they use a different approach, which is the decentralized one, which is actually really supported by Apple and Google, but not most of the European governments would rather take another option with centralization. The thing is that apart from that, what we see is a real concern from the media as to what is the purpose of this app actually, because I mean such an app is a real step against data privacy in general. People are not used to give over the government's health data.
Our new daily tools are Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and others we never heard before, and now we are working with them every day. And of course, most of them are coming from the US, at least what we are using in Germany. There might be also other solutions from China. Why is that? Is that because data privacy is, because we have, of course, especially regarding Zoom, discussions about data privacy and cybersecurity. Is this really, could that be because data privacy is initially a minor obstacle in the US?
Well, that's an interesting question. I can certainly see how from the outside looking in, one might assume that it's minor, but the reality is, from sitting here as a practicing lawyer, the truth is that the privacy law, security law for data in the US is actually highly fragmented, draws from a number of different sources. I mean, as I've already mentioned, we don't have a comprehensive national data protection law. So at the federal level, our laws tend to be by industry, so by healthcare with HIPAA, or financial services, Greenleach-Bliley, or to protect a vulnerable segment of the population, like children under the age of 13. We have the FTC, who relies on something totally unrelated to data. It's the authority to regulate interstate commerce, which is what they rely on to take steps to protect the privacy of consumer data. And then at yet another level, the states have been very active over the last 24 months. In 2019, and I may be off just a tiny bit, but the last stat I looked at, states had introduced about 150 different laws to protect consumer data privacy. I mean, the number of things are dizzying. The recent state laws, focus on industry sometimes, insurance, sometimes it's categories of data, biometric data, or different technologies like AI. And then as soon as they're introduced, for example, the biometric data law in Illinois is currently under litigation, because the question is, would it apply to someone from Florida who was visiting Illinois when their biometric data was collected? So we can find lots of different ways, and it can be a challenge initially to figure out which laws apply to the business enterprise or the data processing activity that someone wants to embark upon. The California Consumer Privacy Act is the first and most comprehensive data protection law in the United States, and especially for business organizations that were not required to comply with GDPR, and that became clarified once the territorial scope was the guidance provided on that was very welcome. But there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of businesses that were not required to comply with the GDPR, and for them, the CCPA is, and here when I was thinking of this outline, I came up with a number of different terms. Groundbreaker is the one I settled on, but I could also call it a shock inducer. It's a brand new concept for these companies. Just a couple of examples. The definition of personal information is actually broader than under the GDPR, which is astonishing in some respects. It's broader, but for a US audience, the fact that business contact information or consumer profiles would be considered personal information is really a surprise. The goalpost between personal information and non-personal information has basically been eradicated. And so those are long settled assumptions. We actually have case law on it. But for California residents, all of that has changed. We have about a dozen states considering similar laws. So the nightmare scenario for business is 50, God, I can't even say it, 50 different data protection laws to cope with when conducting business nationally. Hopefully it won't get that far. I mean, if we are encouraged, and I know we're going to discuss this later, but I'm encouraged by the fact one silver lining with COVID may be that the drive for a federal data protection law will actually be renewed. We can certainly hope for that as one of the results. There's one more thing I want to mention, because this may be relevant to some of you with clients in the US. The CCPA permits a private cause of action by an individual against a company in California or governed by CCPA that sustains a data breach if they fail to use reasonable means to protect the security. The key thing in this provision of the CCPA is that the plaintiff need not prove damages. They are entitled to statutory damages that are fixed by law. And so plaintiff's attorneys, in fact, there may be a couple of those pending against Zoom as we speak. So that's going to spawn some additional litigation, but there are really dozens of things I could cite with CCPA. So I'm probably running up against my time, but I would say that the availability of these new technologies from the US are available and developed and become available despite the fragmented laws in the US, and definitely not because of them.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful, because really we have always, quite often, a very different view probably on this, because we do not know enough about all that in the US, and probably the same thing for China. I don't know, Michael. Very often here in public discussions in Europe, China is considered as a country with very limited rights for data privacy regulations in the relationship between state and citizen. Is that also totally wrong, or is it a correct view?
This is actually a very interesting question. In China, we do have a lot of laws actually regulate this area. Like, for example, separate security law of People's Republic of China. It does say that the stimulate is the protection of personal information, but there's no clear definition of personal information. So what does that really mean, right? There are tort law. The tort law, it also say that it should protect the right of privacy. So what does the right of privacy mean? We have just passed the very first PRC civil code, which will become effective January 1st, 2021. In the civil code, very first time in the history, in a law level, we have a regulation rules under, but from the law level, that it says clearly what the personal information means. So it says that refers to all kinds of information recorded by electricity or otherwise that can be used to independently identify or be combined with other information to identify specific natural persons, including natural person's name, date of birth, ID numbers, biometric information, address, telephone number, and mail address, house information, whereabouts, so on. Interesting enough, right before we passed this law, right, coronavirus came. And because of that, then there are, like, if it's not 1,000, at least hundreds of different kinds of cell phone apps that have been invented. And we have to get a smartphone, and we have to download that app, and we have to show the barcode every single place you go, right? So you go to the office, you got a temperature tested, and then you show the barcode, and then you go to shopping mall, same story. Even when you come home, right? You got to do it. And all of those cell phone apps require you provide everything I was just reading for the personal information. So are we protected or not? This is actually really interesting. And then there's always an argument, I guess, between the protection of personal information versus the public interest.
Yeah. Absolutely. Same here. Same discussions everywhere, I guess. And that brings us already, because we already talked much about these apps everywhere, these tracking and tracing apps, which is really something we have really very political discussions about that. So even in Germany, with very strong privacy regulations, and even if a solution which is not really that strict and tough, but of course we also have here discussions from several organizations and groups of people who are saying, well, this is the first time the government is trying to get every information about our private lives, and they of course will abuse all these information. And therefore, in Germany, we are quite behind, I think, everybody else. Here's our solution. This is the solution. If you go into a restaurant, then you have this piece of paper here, and you have to fill it out by hand, by pen, and to give it back to the host in the restaurant. Great that you are our guest today, and then we have these really great long German words, which is a Corona caused restaurant guest registration in almost one word. And then you have to give the date, time of arrival, the time when you left, your table number. I never know the table number when I'm in the restaurant because it's not interesting for me, but all right. Then your full name, your telephone number, your full address, and then all the names and phone numbers of your guests. And then you have to sign it. And then you give it back to the host in the restaurant. And he is, of course, putting all these pieces of papers in the huge box. And well, then there are two solutions. One is he finally has all the addresses and telephone numbers of all his guests, and that is great because he always wanted to have their addresses to send them mailings, newsletters, and everything else. But if we have really a COVID case, then good luck with searching for the right people with these kinds of papers. And of course, there are many people who are writing Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and other names, and of course they never give their proper address and telephone number. So this is completely useless. And Michael, you already mentioned that in China it is working completely different. You have these apps and now the solution based on the health QR code. And as you already talked a bit about that, probably you can do it very short and just describe a bit more. What is that app and what is the concept behind?
I want to talk about different type of apps, basically just to give you an idea, they serve different function. I am a little bit surprised, by the way, this German way require actually a piece of paper and then use hand to write it, right? The very important point during the various pandemic is you don't want to touch anybody. You want to keep the distance, right? And you want to practice the social distance. So a type of apps, cell phone apps for payment actually become very, very useful in mainland China. As a matter of fact, we have multiple ones. We have Alipay, we have WeChat Pay, we have whatever. All what you have to do is to scan a barcode and done. You don't need to use a cash. You don't need to take out your credit card from wallet. All what you need to do is just scan the barcode and it's scan the barcode and you don't have to touch it. That's the very point, right? The other type of apps is similar to the forms you just showed us, right? So there are separate app designed for airlines to track wherever you are. So if you lie, your cell phone, they won't lie because the service provider, they provide all of the information. You cannot lie, right? But they still ask you to volunteer those information so that the government say, hey, you volunteer the information, we never steal that. Okay, fine.
then there's different kind of information and different kind of channel that you have to go through. You live in a building, community, then you have to register electricity. So there's a barcode, you have to scan it, volunteer information. You work with a company in the office, in the building. Now, the building require you to provide the information, right? You travel, the airline require you to do that, right? Then if there's are any special things that say in whatever city, in whatever district, or on any specific flight, there's one confirmed case. Then everybody have to put in the quarantine, but not only in the quarantine, they also want you know where all of those people been traveled before, and they can track the people who they, you know, have contact with each other beforehand, and they trace more and more. This is basically how that works. It's not perfect. No, it's not. But it's what we are, is what is available right now in mainland China. And it seems that the more cooperative people are, then the better result come out. So that's basically where we are right now. So you basically, they try to track down, record every single thing, and there's different apps and for people to have their normal life back, but in a very different style.
Of course. Benjamin, we had now today in German newspapers, the big story was that France has started its Corona app, Stop COVID, and what happened? France is ahead of us. There, you are much more developed in this case as we are, because, as I already mentioned, we are working with that, and we are expecting, well, in several weeks, an app solution. But what happened to France? So what is the idea behind?
Well, Marcus, your situation is not so bad because at least you have paper, and I am supposed to have an app, but the app was not published yet, and we don't know precisely why. As I told you before, the app was developed really, really rapidly. The government rushed on this on the very first days of COVID, and then announced that they will develop this system. Still, 2 or 3 months just to convince the Data Protection Authority, convince the legislator, convince the Constitutional Court, and so on, develop, enter into negotiation with Google and Apple, and I think this might be the reason why the app is not released yet. Is that what we hear is that there was no agreement with Apple, so basically there is a technical issue that might affect the functioning of the app. Still, well, there was many things to do in 2 or 3 months, including convincing people to use such an app. One interesting issue is that the Data Protection Authority was consulted by the government, and what they say is that basically the system that would be used by the French government would comply with GDPR because it is justified by public health reasons. So the attempt to data protection is reasonable for the Data Protection Authority, but it is reasonable as long as the system is proven to be working, or at least sufficiently working and useful, which I hear will be the case solely if something like 60% of the French people use the app. And that's a real concern for me, at least. Why? Because, well, actually, we've been locked down for months, but now we are allowed to go out. And from the very first day, French people could go out and were unlocked down. Well, basically everyone went out on parks, drinking wine, eating with friends, and so on, just like social distancing never existed. In this context, if you ask some French people to install an app that will allow the government to trace who they have dinner with, in a situation where there is no so many people dying at hospitals, because, well, that's a good thing. At least the epidemic is apparently somehow diminishing. But still, in this context, having people to install such an app that is seen as some kind of foot in the door of an attempt to data protection might be difficult. And at the end of the
same discussion here, but as far as we all know, the data is anonymized. So where's the problem then?
Well, it's presented as anonymized. Actually, it's pseudo no IT system that is well, that cannot be breached. You know, it just doesn't exist to date. Actually, the government published part of the source code of the software and invited hackers to try and find a hole in the code. There was no obvious flaws, but still, everybody, including the government, realized that the solution cannot be perfect on the security point of view. So there is no real issue here, because actually the app is not supposed to be processing geographical data, and it will just trace who you've been in contact with on an anonymous basis. But still, it's working on the basis of Bluetooth, which is known to have flaws, for instance. And then the data will be centralized, so it will just go through the telco network to a centralized server, and who knows what might happen. So it might be nothing, but still, it is seen as a foot in the door. So my feeling is that somehow maybe the government is not expecting that 60% of the French people will install the application, but they might be seeing this as just some kind of, you know, I told you the government rushed in this situation, just like the companies. But maybe this is some kind of way to prepare themselves for a next kind of pandemics. Maybe another step of this one that could come later on, or maybe another one. We see that China was very well prepared, like other Asian countries, which is not the situation in Europe. And I see this tracing app story just as some kind of preparation for the future.
Mary, how's the situation in the US? We heard before that you have very different levels of data privacy in each state, and would it be possible to have one common solution?
Probably not in my lifetime, Marcus. Possibly, let's put it that way. I mean, we have here, of course, the federalist system, which reserves to the federal government, the central government, certain functions, but the various states still retain a lot of authority. And one of the areas where they continue to have a lot of authority is in public health. And the decision of whether or not to use digital contact tracing, DCT, falls to the states. And most of the states are still using the manual, labor-intensive contact tracing methodology. And when you pulled up your form from the restaurants, I was wishing I had a screenshot of, you know, a room filled with, you know, boxes and filing cabinets of information, because it really is literally that labor intensive. And there is concern about privacy issues. I mean, right now, DCT has only been adopted by a small number of states. I mean, last I checked, it was 3. And it is causing a lot of concern around privacy. Remember, coinciding at a time when people are heading to online for the rest of their lives. So they're very much aware of the data. And here, a reassurance that data was going to be anonymized or de-identified or, you know, aggregated or whatever phrase it is. In the US, even in the tech industry, those terms tend to be used interchangeably. They, even in the context of contracts, they can be viewed as meaning different things to different people. We do have some definitions in the CCPA that may be helpful if cited, but you know, when people hear it's anonymized, much less pseudonymized, pseudonymized, excuse me, that's you know, pretty much a foreign concept. So anonymization is not very reassuring. There's also at the state level a lack of time and sometimes funds to develop the apps. I mean, I'm in northern New Jersey. We're in the metro New York area. So I'm sitting about 15 miles from Midtown. So New Jersey, New York City, and the Connecticut suburbs were the epicenter of the US outbreak. And for anybody in authority to suggest we have to take, you know, even a month to develop an app before we start doing this is just not going to fly at any level. New York City, for example, I forget the number, but they've hired hundreds of contact tracers, and the state of New Jersey as well. I mean, so there's a lot of resources being devoted to that. The mobile app, as Benjamin described, may be something for, God help us, the next pandemic, because I don't know that it's going to be able to be developed here as quickly. There's also doubt about obtaining sufficient participation levels to make it meaningful. A new app on the phone where the government is going to essentially track you and have all that information is going to cause some serious questions here. And so, you know, there are doubts about that. I don't know if we would get what kind of participation level we would get. Now, flip that, there is a little bit of a potential bright side here. There are two bills pending in Congress right now. One introduced at the House level by Democrats, and then another introduced in the Senate by Republicans. Not surprisingly, they conflict with one another. But less than 24 hours ago, a bipartisan bill on this topic was introduced in the Senate. And I literally have it on my screen, my split screen here to read when this is concluded. But I'm extremely happy to hear that it's a bipartisan effort, because that bodes well for some kind of federal law governing the use of personal information collected, and that will be a critical factor here. So I was very encouraged by that happening.
I think one of the most interesting for the future issue or discussion, which is next point here, and it is about data economy, and it's also related, I guess, to the crisis very much, because we have seen that if we are looking on the economic effect of the crisis of COVID-19, we can see that especially the old economy is suffering with its complex global supply chains, and they are really suffering under the situation where you have everywhere in the world your suppliers you're not able to produce, and then of course your customers in another country are not able to buy, and the transportation is also quite difficult. And we have seen that many other companies which are data driven are almost unharmed or actually benefit from the COVID crisis. Probably not if you're looking at platforms like Uber or Airbnb, because they have a platform for an industry which is completely locked down at the moment, but others are doing extremely well. And the question is, if we have a data-driven industry, data is one of the most important assets of a company. Or is becoming more and more very important assets. One of the biggest problems we have to solve in the near future, if we want to have a global market still, then we need an idea about how to handle data as an asset. And we have many discussions about that: data ownership, data sovereignty, government control data, open data. Data as an essential infrastructure, so other companies need to have access on a fair and reasonable basis. Many discussions about that, and So as the US usually, if you have discussions about that in the US, usually we will have the same discussions everywhere. So how is the situation in the US at the moment?
Well, this is a pet topic of mine as I watched this evolve over the last several years. And it appears to me that commercially, there is a growing recognition of data as a separate asset class, distinct from intellectual property. Data comes, in my view, with its own set of laws that govern its use. One can't use data, for anything that you're not authorized to do. And that is a different statement than saying it's governed by the copyright law in the manner that some databases are, or patents, or even trade secrets. You can have some overlaps. So I think there is a growing recognition of that. And at the same time here, consumers are becoming aware that when they provide the data to an online platform, of course it's used to provide the service or product that's been promised, but there's a growing realization that there's also tremendous uses of that data that results in financial benefit to the platform and to the others with whom they share that data. And I can give you a couple of examples immediately. The CCPA, and again, this is another shocker for the US audience, but the CCPA requires disclosure of financial incentives offered for personal information. So perhaps the easiest example is if I sign on to Bloomingdale's and they give me a 10% coupon for my first purchase, if I give them my email, there you go. The disclosures required in that regard are pretty extensive. And the other one I want to bring to your attention, because I really believe it's the harbinger of the future. It was a bipartisan bill introduced last year in the Senate called the Dashboard Act. That's the acronym, and I'm sure the name is a mile long, but it's called the Dashboard Act. And that did a couple of very interesting things with respect to data. It required major online platforms to disclose to their users the monetary value of the personal data collected in dollars and cents. And there was a consternation as to weak a word for what that would cause, but a very interesting concept. And the other thing they did, recognizing in this bill that it's difficult for businesses and auditors to come up with a common methodology to value the data, this bill would have already developed a methodology for public companies to use in value. So and based on what I'm seeing in transactions that are data driven, the paradigm is shifting. And it's shifting practically, commercially, and also legally. And like most of these issues, the commercial sector is going to drive the change. So the contracts that we see and the deals we make probably are going to be way ahead of the law. But I'm seeing that trend in both areas simultaneously. So I'm much encouraged by that.
Great, thank you. Michael, China, what is the situation there? IP or something else, database rights? How do you handle data?
Data is money. Data is the future. Data is everything. I mean, really, it is what we see now, right? It's already happening. It has already happened. We have one of the most popular social media app is called WeChat. It's a combination of Facebook, Twitter, and what else it consists?
WhatsApp.
What's up? There you go. We're Chinese now. It's one of the most popular things, right? You can pretty much do everything with it, right? But this is just me, right? I don't speak on behalf of any other group or any other company, but just me. When I talk with my friend through WeChat, we talk about food. And right after we finish our conversation, boom, there's an app come up. You want a hot pot tonight? Nearby you, $3 off. Well, RMB, okay, whatever that is. And then you talk about cars.
boom, Mercedes new model just come out. You want to have a drive? Right? You talk about housing. Oh, hey, I want to actually have some sort of location and 3-bedroom and 2 bathrooms. Boom, one code, the best real estate developer. We can help you with all. I don't know I'm not an engineer. I have no idea how that happens, but I can only just tell you, this really happened in my life. And are we protected? Is my personal data being infringed? Right? That's one of the questions. Now, that's one other thing about this VChat. The other thing I thought was interesting is that people's court in China start getting smarter, right? By seeing that, I mean, in the old times, there are many of the cases where when the people's court will serve the summon and the documents and everything, then they always got wrong address. The defendant has always have a way to run away from taking those documents, so they would not show up in the court hearing, of course, and then everything will be delayed. So if the court documents cannot be served before the hearing, then they have to publish that, and that will take like 2 months and this, forever. And then when they have a hearing, they are not showing up, and then when they issue the ruling, then they cannot just issue the ruling, then they have to publish the ruling. That's another 2 months. So when you build up all of this together, 6 months has been wasted without even seeing the defendant. So what can the people's court do in China? They work with Taobao, Alibaba, JD.com, all of the e-commerce, right? Because they're thinking, if you're a regular person living in the modern world like today in China, then you're always shopping online, especially during the various pandemic, right? You cannot go shopping. All of the department store be shut it down, and the superstore shut it down, right? All of those, whatever things being shut it down. You cannot even get out, but you can still have food. Order the whatever you want to buy through online. Click. Now, those information about one's cell phone number, address to be delivered, email address, with the coupon Mary was talking about, right? Everything are super accurate. So people start thinking, why don't I serve the legal documents through those platform? They did. There are a few of the courts all over military, only a few of them. They so-called said they want to give a test, and very successful. The service successful rate rates it up, right? But the question is, the people's court can only do what the law provide them to do, right? And it's way more efficient to do the e-service. Yes, that's true. But again, the same story. Are the people's personal data being infringed this time by the people's court? that's actually the question that we're discussing right now. And the last part I want to discuss, for this thing is that we have seen quite a few banks in China got themselves in trouble. What happened was those accounting manager, the manager for the personal house, being captured and put in custody. What did they do? They actually used their personal key, e-key, to log into their system and withdraw and download a lot of information, including personal data of their customers. Then they turn around to sell to insurance company, sell to other OEM or other company who actually need those data to provide service to. And we can see the clear attitude of the Chinese government. They really want to do more. They want to crack down those illegal actions, and they want to clean up those environment and protect the personal data. And that is going to be for a long run project for them.
Benjamin, you're the last
Markus.
As I said before, you're French and you're European, and we realize that if we want to find a solution for how to treat data as an economic asset, we have to find a solution which is not only in one country a solution, but hopefully globally one day, but especially in Europe, as we have a common market, a single market, and I think we should better find a common solution for the most important assets of many companies. So what is the situation in Europe and France?
Well, Markus, a very good news is that we already have a solution. Well, it's not a perfect solution, but at least we have something. As you know, we in Europe had adopted like 25 years ago a directive that protects databases. So obviously databases are a little bit different from data. It's a different thing, but still, based on this regulation, which for the record provides for two types of protection, one which is very similar to copyright, and another one which is maybe more interesting for our debate, which is called the sui generis right, which creates a right for the people who invest in order to create a database to allow or not the extraction of a substantial part of the database. So if you extract or use a substantial part of a database, well, at the end of the day, you use data. So through the protection of the database, we have some kind of protection for the data. It's a good start. It's not perfect, but it's a good start. On the European level, actually, this issue is really debated. Of course, Europe realized the importance of data, and obviously they do not want to rely on legislation who was thought about, discussed, and enacted in 1995. It's another era, and we need a new regulation concerning the actual one, the actual era that is just in front of us. So basically, there were discussions in the European Commission, and they made announcements that they will draft a new data act that should be ready, or at least discussed, in 2021. So it's not tomorrow, but still it's there, and we have a beginning of protection through the directive of 1995. On the French level, apart from the fact that we, of course, implemented the database directive of 1995. Well, France took another direction lately, realizing that, of course, data protection of the data is essential. But if you want to develop, for instance, AI, you want to allow as many French entities as possible to process data. And if you only rely on legislation that just make data a property, you cannot, well, have those companies that need a lot of data to develop AI. So basically, France embraced the open data movement in 2016, voting a law that really, well, tries to develop open data in France. And as a result, that's the good news for France, at least. In 2019, France was recognized as one of the worldwide leaders in the field of open data. So it's kind of a good situation, but still, when it comes to the real data economy, on a legal point of view, we are still stuck with this directive from 1995, which is okay, but maybe not enough. So we still have to wait a little bit to have a better solution. But I still, well, the European Commission is working on it, so it's, well, very positive.
Thank you very much. We are over time, and I think the issue of data economy, I think, would be worth for a discussion on its own, and we definitely have to keep up the discussion because I think this will be the most important, or one of the most important questions economically in the near future. And if we do not find a solution for that, well, we are putting or creating many obstacles against creation of new business models and even smaller business, AI, you named it already, and many very important solutions which are only are possible with an idea how to handle data and how to trade with data, how to give access to data, even if you are not the big data gatherer like Google or Alibaba. So very interesting discussions, and well, from the audience probably, because it is not interactive, our panel discussion. We would love to hear your ideas about hot topics in the near future. What could be very important for us as TerraLex, as a global network of legal service providers? Where can we create solutions for our global clients? So give us information, send us an email or whatever else. You got Nicole's email, you got our emails. And well, I would be very pleased to start that discussion with you all. And thank you, Mary, Michael, and Benjamin, for the discussion.
Thank you, Markus.
Of course, we did not manage to be in time, and it was my fault. Sorry. Bye-bye.
All right, bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.